Hi there, me again. In today's video, we're going to be doing something a little bit different, and I'm going to be talking about how you can make your photos a little bit more cinematic. So let's get into it. So, on the internet, in the past couple years, the word cinematic has gotten thrown around quite a bit, and I use it a lot too. And what I've noticed is basically the internet has come to a consensus that the word cinematic just means dark, moody, mysterious imagery. And that is part of what can make a photo cinematic, but cinema as a art form is a wide gamut. There's a lot of different genres of films out there, and you don't have to be dark and moody and mysterious to be cinematic. So hopefully I can use this video as a way to kind of expand on the topic of cinematic photos and imagery in general, and be of some help to people who want to make more movie-like images, but maybe not go down that moody rabbit hole all the time. So to start off, I'm going to give you guys a couple of tips on things you can do in camera to start off making your photos look inherently more cinematic. And then once we move through that list, I'm going to give you some things to look for out in the world that would be more cinematic subjects that you can capture. So the first little in-camera hack I have for you to make your images look a little bit more like movies is to shoot in a cinema aspect ratio. Now, many movies that you see today use the 2.39:1 aspect ratio, which is very wide. And when I'm using a more widescreen cinematic crop on my photos, I prefer the slightly older but very similar 2.35:1 aspect ratio. And you can actually make whatever aspect ratio you want a preset in Lightroom. So what I've done is I've taken that 2.35:1 aspect ratio and saved it as a preset in Lightroom so that I can quickly crop to that if I want to in post. Now, just going out in the field and shooting full width images and then cropping later is probably not going to work that well because you'll cut off a lot of what you were originally framing off of the top and bottom of the image. So what I would recommend is go into your camera. A lot of digital cameras have this now, is you can set markers or guides, and you can actually program those cinematic aspect ratios into your rear screen so that you can actually frame things up how you want to crop them later, which will give you much better framing. If you're using a slightly older digital camera, another thing I've seen people do is put some gaff tape on the top and bottom portions of their rear LCD so they get at least an approximation of that wide aspect ratio. Now, the second tip I have for you to make your photos look a little bit more movie-like is to expose for the highlights. Now, what that means is essentially you are finding the bright parts of your image and making sure those are correctly exposed, and then bringing up shadow detail as you need to later in post. Now, this is just a pretty good rule of thumb anyways if you're shooting RAW, because bringing up the shadows is much easier to do in RAW files than bringing down highlights. So this is just a good rule of thumb in general. But on top of that, cinematographers like to lean into the shadows. They like to use layers of highlights and shadows to lead your eye around the frame, make the viewer focus on what they're supposed to be focusing on, whether that be a character or a detail in the frame. And you can use this too in your images. I see a lot of people try to perfectly expose everything and just pull out the most dynamic range they can out of an image. And you don't necessarily need detail and everything. Some dark parts of an image can add texture and mood and story to your photo. So lean into that. So the third tip I have for you in making cinematic photos and just making your life a little bit easier in general when you're editing is to pick a custom or preset white balance and not use auto white balance. Now, cinematographers craft a different look for every film they shoot, and they need to control as many variables of the exposure and the look of the film as they can, and white balance is a very important aspect. Your white balance is what's going to give your photo that initial look and bit of character that it has right out of the gate. So it's important that you pick a white balance that you like and that you think works for the scene you're in. Also, if you shoot with auto white balance, your camera is going to change the white balance basically every time you move your camera. And then if you take a series of photos and you go to edit them later, you're going to have to start from a different point with each photo, and you can't really just edit one photo and use that look across a series of photos. So using a locked off or preset white balance is going to save you a lot of time in editing in general. So essentially, just pick a white balance that looks good in the situation that you're in and stick with that for a while. And if you want to go an extra step into that cinema realm, most cinema film stocks are either daylight balance or tungsten balance. So maybe start with one of those. The fourth tip I have for you to make your photos feel a little bit more like a film is to use shutter speed intentionally. Now, most films are shot at 24 frames per second with a 180-degree shutter. And essentially what that means is when you're watching a film, your brain is putting each of those frames together into something that makes sense and looks clear. But if you pause it at any point, any moving aspect of the frame is probably going to have a little bit of blur to it. Now, cinematographers sometimes, for specific scenes, either crank the shutter or the frame rate a little bit higher or make it go lower. And they do that for a couple of reasons. They might use a higher frame rate or shutter speed to get crisper frames in something like a fight scene where they want each frame to have more detail. Or they might slow the shutter speed down to make things extra blurry if they want to show the perspective of, say, a character who's under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Now, in the context of photography, we usually use pretty high shutter speeds because we want everything to be crisp and clear. So your best bet to make your photos feel a little bit more like a movie is to slow your shutter speed down a little bit and add a little bit of blur. And one really effective method of photography for that is to use shutter drag photography. Now, basically pick your subject, use a slower shutter speed, like maybe 1/30th, 1/15th of a second, and follow your subject through the frame while it's moving. Hopefully that gets you a crisp subject and a little bit of blur in the background, which will automatically make people think they're watching something with motion, just like a motion picture. Okay, so now we've gone over a few in-camera tips that might help make your photos feel a little bit more movie-like. Now let's talk about what you can go out and look for in the field that might help your scenes in general look like something out of a movie. So in order to make photos that feel a little bit more like a movie, you need to ask yourself, what is a movie? And at its core, a movie is just a story, and cinema is a method of telling a story. And movies have the advantage of having a couple of hours and hundreds of thousands of frames to tell that story. And with photography, you may only have one frame to tell a story. So you need to pack in as many storytelling elements as you can into that one frame to really drive home that cinematic quality. So probably the most important elements of storytelling are the characters. Movies have tons of characters, and characters are what drives the plot forward in a movie. So it's really important that your photo have a protagonist or main character, or at least a subject to focus on. And it would be really nice if your photo also had some sort of antagonist or secondary character to work opposite your main character and create some sort of a plot. And that brings us to the second element of storytelling, and that is the plot or the action that's happening. And this is where you can really branch out from that dark, moody, mysterious vibe that cinematic has come to mean on the internet. You can do that if you want. You could find a dark, moody figure in some backlit scenario and use light and shadow to make a really dark, mysterious image. That could be cinematic. Or maybe you could go out and look for a couple of friends that are just walking down the sidewalk having a laugh. Maybe you're trying to emulate a comedy with your photography. Or maybe you're trying to look for people that are arguing and you want to emulate a sort of drama with your photography. There's a lot of different genres of movies out there. So you have your pick. The world is your oyster, and you just need to find some type of action or plot point to base your photo around if you want it to look like a movie. This brings us to our third and final element of storytelling that I'll talk about in this video, and that is the setting of your story. Now, the setting plays a central role in setting the mood or tone of a story, and in some cases, the setting almost becomes another character in the story. Basically, you want to just show the world that your characters are living in, and this can add depth and context to the story that you're trying to tell. So let's take that example of the comedy of the two people walking down the sidewalk. Say you found that in the street. See if you can find something in the background that gives that some sort of context. Maybe there's a fire hydrant that is blowing a bunch of water everywhere all over the sidewalk, and maybe that's what those two main characters are laughing about. That would give a lot of story and context to your photo. Another thing to keep in mind when you're wanting to make cinematic photos, and I wasn't sure whether to include this in the scene section or the character section because it's kind of in the middle, but you need to be mindful of how busy your scene is and how it distracts from the characters in your scene. Now, cinematographers and directors spend a lot of time blocking out scenes and placing characters where they need to be so that there's the right amount of visual weight on what needs to be focused on and not too much distraction around it. And I have a lot of photos that I've taken on the street that I really like, but I wouldn't necessarily classify them as cinematic because there's just a lot going on. There's a lot of extra people and there's a lot of chaos that really kind of distracts the eye and doesn't really have a main theme. It just kind of has a bunch of energy. And that can be good, but probably not what I would consider the most cinematic. So when you find a scene or something happening that you think is going to be cinematic, keep a lookout for elements that may add distraction and try and frame them in a way that will enhance the composition and not take away from it. Now let's talk about photos that use the setting as the main character and don't necessarily have any characters in the frame. I take a lot of photos like this, and I try and think of these photos as establishing shots where you're seeing the larger picture and you're about to go into that and see the inner workings of it with the characters and everything. So with a lot of my photos, I try and frame them up in a way that makes the audience wonder what's going on in there currently, what might happen there later, something like that, that kind of gets the mind going, creating a story itself. That way you still have those aspects of storytelling even though you don't have characters in a specific frame. So I think I've rambled on for long enough. Hopefully I gave you some helpful insight, and hopefully my example photos were good at kind of illustrating my points. And yeah, just get out there and make some photos that look like movies. I think the word cinematic doesn't really get the wide variety that it could because it's a wide gamut. There's a lot of different genres of films out there, and there's a lot of different ways to make photos look cinematic. So get out there and push yourself to try something different, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye now.